Let's first create another collection here. So let's go ahead and say start collection, and this is going to be users. Okay, say next. Let's add a few fields here. I'm going to say avatar URL. I'm just going to say HTTPS for now. So pick some photos. Let's add a next field, display name. Just going to say Paulo. Add the next one. These are just fields we're going to be adding. Profession, quote, be happy. And we can add a new one here is UI ID. So we don't have anything, that's fine. Just put some gibberish like that. Hit enter, and voila. So we should have one in our users collection. We should have one user, and we have these fields here. All right, very good. So what we need to do is we need to create an actual user. This is just something we added ourselves. Let's go ahead and create an actual user following the same recipe I just showed you. So that means then we have to go back to our code, and we're gonna go to create account. So I can say Command P to search for a certain file. So create account form. I think that should work. Yes, this is where we create the account, and that's very important to know. This is where we need to work, because again, remember, the idea is that when we create the account, we can use the then method, the promise method, meaning once everything is created, create user with email and password. That is great. It is all done. Instead of signing them in right away, we will actually do something else before that, which is we're going to go ahead and create that user. So right here, let's get rid of this. This was before this. Then here, I'm going to go ahead and say the following. I'm going to say if, in this case, value. Notice value just user credential. That means I'm just going to check value.user if the user is not equal to null. So we do have a user. Only then will I go ahead and create this user. So I'm going to say create user. Now to create our user, we need to create these fields, right? Now for now, because this user had just been created, meaning we've actually literally created a user with email and password. Remember, this user that I'm talking about here, that we just created here, is the Firebase auth user. Okay, it's not the user we are going to be creating ourselves, which we are going to put in a different collection. So in this case here, because we've just created this new user, Firebase user, the user doesn't have a lot of things. Meaning if you hover over this user, actually this one here, let's go ahead and I'm going to show you. And say if I say value.user dot, look at all this field. It has display name, email verify, and all these other fields. So it doesn't have a display name because we haven't said anything, but we know that it has an email at least. All right. So what we can do, since this email that this user has, that was just created, is going to be the same email as this one here, because that's what we used to create it, I'm going to use a little trick. So instead of adding as a username or a display name to this user we're going to be creating, instead of adding this whole email, I'm going to just chop up this email and get just the first part of the email that will probably have that username. For instance, if my email address that I added was john@me.com, what we're going to do is we're going to cut everything from @ forward so that we get left with John only. And we're going to use this John to pass into our create user function so that then we can create a user that can go here, and we'll have at least a display name. Anything else is going to be null, which is fine. Anything else except this UI ID, which we'll see. Does that make sense? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to extract this email outside here. So let's say string email is equal to, let me just cut all of this to that. Okay. And then I'm going to use this email instead, like this. Okay, same thing. But now inside here, I'm going to use that email. I'm going to create another string called display name, and then I'm going to say email, right? This email here, and I'm going to splice it up. So I'm going to first make it to string, and then I'm going to say .split method. So the split method allows us to pass some sort of a pattern. So in this case, we're going to pass here a regular expression to say, okay, where are we going to split inside of single quotes? I want to split it by where we have the @ sign. Again, going back to this, I'm saying when we get here, this is going to be the part from where I'm going to split. So what this means now, this is actually going to be transformed when I call this split into an array. This array is going to have 2 elements. The first one is going to be John, because we split everything, and the second part is going to be me.com, something like that. Well, if it's an array or a list, right, that's what we call them in Dart, but same thing really, that means then we have indices, which means if I want just to get this first one here, all I can do, I can just put inside of square brackets like that and say I want the first index, like that. Okay, so again, this means I'm just going to go get from the email, the full email, I'm going to get John, which I'm going to use as our display name. And I'm going to pass here our display name as such. Okay, I don't know why this says value.user. That's not what we want. I think that was from earlier. But anyway, there we go. Okay, so this hasn't been created, of course. Let's go ahead and say command period. I'm going to create this method. Actually, the other thing I need to pass here is going to be the context. I'm just going to go ahead and say context like this. So build context, context like that. Now we're going to change something here. I'm going to make this future and void like this, okay? Because we're not going to return anything, but this has to be a future. We're going to be dealing with getting information from our Firebase, uauth, and so forth. So I'm going to make this async, of course, to get this to work. First, we're going to go ahead and fetch this user's collection and say user collection reference. Yes, it's a long name, but it's descriptive, so we're going to go with that. I'm going to say then Firebase Firestore.instance, get collection, and I'm going to go ahead and say users. Again, remember it has to be exactly the same name as the collection name. And there we go. Now I'm going to then instantiate our Firebase auth instance like that. In fact, I'm just going to create a variable. So call this auth. And then I'm going to say it's equal to Firebase instance like this. Gives me the wrong one. Okay, there we go. All right, once I have that, I'm going to have to extract the UIID because remember, every auth has that UIID. How do I get the UIID? But it has to be through the user. First, how do I get a user from our auth? Well, first of all, I'm going to say auth dot. I can get the current user and then say UIID like that. Put that into a variable. I'm going to put that into a string because all of those come as a string. Okay. Once I have that ID, then I can actually create a user map object. In this case, we're going to create an actual data class of user. But for now, I can just go ahead and say something like this. Map is going to be a string key and dynamic for value. Call this user is equal to display name. Remember, it has to be, since we started, has to be the same name as this field. All right, so display name is going to have what value? UIID value as such. And while we're here, I can also say that I want the UI, oops, not that, I'm sorry. I meant to say, we're going to just pass this display name. So display name as such. And then I'm going to also UIID, pass in a UIID, which is going to be UIID, right? Which is this guy here. So essentially, I'm just mapping these two. The rest could be just null. That's totally fine. Put some column like that. And while I'm here, let me just actually add all of them for completion. So I'm going to say and we can just say null, for instance. Okay, any of these we can give it null, that's fine, but at least we have something complete. So now that I have our user, we can save then that new user into our collection, so to have something like this. How do we do that? Well, we have the user collection reference. We're going to use it. I'm going to say user collection reference. I can invoke the add method, which in this case requires to pass a map, which we just created. So once that user is created, remember what I need to do actually is invoke the then method again. And I want to make sure that this is indeed a block. This is when we actually call this method. So I'm going to copy all of this. Let's see, cut all of that and put inside here. Save all of that. Okay, let's look what's happening here. So we make sure when we create an account to validate it. So then we go ahead and proceed creating that account. We pass email and password. Life is good. Once that is done, it's completely fine. Once that is done, we use the then promise method there, and we check, make sure that the user is not null, right? There is actually a user that was created. And then what we do is we invoke the create user. So now we're going to create our own user collection here. So we have that control. Okay. So to do that, we use this create user method, which we pass a display name, which we got from splicing our email and gotten the first item or the first username they've added before the @ Okay, just a little trick. And once we've done that, we log that user in with email and password because we know that they have been created, and we're going to log them in there. Once that happens, so once the user is logged in, we navigate to the main screen page. Now let's go ahead and rerun everything because I have it not running. Click here, start running, start debugging. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create an account, just a new email. I'm going to call this, let's say, gina@me.com. I'm going to give a password, create account. Voila. Notice things should have worked. Let's go back to our users, and you can see we have another user already. So if you click here, and there is Gina, avatar is null, nope, life is good, and there is this UI code here, UI ID. Now I want to show you that this is indeed what we want to happen because we want to take the UI ID and add to our user that was created from our users authentication. So if you click to the left here, and let's go to our sign-in user. There is Gina, and look at this. You see similarity? TAAS7. If you go back to our Firestore, and you should have the same ID. And this is very crucial, as you will see in the next videos. And the reason why we still see James here is because what we're getting here is actually this book stream that we added earlier because we just want to see if things worked. Okay. But we know that it's working because we see Gina.me is showing there. So Gina was created, and we have the proof here.